40% of hybrid rice traits circulating in parts of Asia trace back, in one form or another, to breeding programs connected to Chinese agricultural research institutions or their licensed downstream partners. That is not a political claim. It is a reconstruction from plant variety registration databases, seed catalog mappings, and cross-border breeding documentation. At the same time, policy discussions in Washington often still treat seed systems as if they are structurally neutral, a background agricultural input rather than a strategic layer of infrastructure. Both perspectives do not fully align, because between national breeding institutes, corporate seed licensing systems, and regional field trials, control over staple crop genetics has shifted into an intellectual property framework layered directly onto biological systems. Quietly, incrementally, through registration filings and licensing agreements rather than explicit strategy announcements. In the International Union for the Protection of New Varieties of Plants, UPOV, records, there is a visible shift over the past 2 decades in who contributes registered plant varieties in key staples like rice and hybrid maize. China's share has increased significantly in specific categories tied to climate-adaptive and high-yield traits. This does not mean political control over crops. It means control over parent lines, the genetic foundation used to produce commercial hybrids. Parent lines are not what farmers plant directly. They are the underlying biological inputs that determine whether a hybrid variety can be reproduced with consistent performance across regions and seasons. And modern agriculture depends heavily on that consistency. Farmers do not optimize for genetic diversity in the abstract. They optimize for yield stability under cost pressure, weather volatility, and pest exposure. That pressure naturally reduces the range of viable seed options over time. This is where convergence begins. China's agricultural research system, including state-linked institutions such as the Chinese Academy of Agricultural Sciences and provincial breeding programs, has spent decades developing crop traits under internal environmental stress conditions. Variable flood zones in the south, heat stress cycles in northern grain regions, and water constraints across arid areas. Those same stress conditions are now emerging in multiple external regions. Heat stress in South Asian wheat cycles, rainfall instability in Southeast Asian rice belts, and drought pressure in parts of Africa are all creating similar trait demands: shorter growth cycles, heat tolerance, and water efficiency. When trait demands converge, breeding solutions also begin to converge, not because of coordination, but because of selection pressure. At that point, different countries and institutions begin arriving at genetically similar solutions, even if they originate from separate research ecosystems. That is where structural dependency can emerge without any single actor controlling the system. It is important to be precise here. China is not the sole or even universal driver of global seed genetics. The United States remains highly influential in maize and soybean genetics through firms like Corteva and historical germplasm libraries. European and international research institutions continue to play a stabilizing role in staple crop development. But the system is no longer centralized around one dominant breeding axis. It is fragmented into competing innovation clusters. And fragmentation does not automatically equal independence, because even fragmented systems can become correlated when they respond to the same environmental signals. If multiple breeding pipelines optimize for similar climate stress factors, their outputs begin to converge and function, even if they differ in origin. That convergence creates a hidden form of interdependence. It does not appear in trade statistics. It appears in field performance under stress. There is a second structural shift layered on top of this. Modern seed IP is increasingly tied to trait bundles rather than single characteristics. Drought resistance, pest resistance, and yield stability are often packaged together in licensed genetic systems. That bundling reduces substitution flexibility, because replacing one component often requires replacing the entire system. At that point, switching away from a dominant seed line is no longer a policy decision. It becomes an agricultural cost calculation with yield penalties attached. And that is where intellectual property begins to behave like infrastructure. We'll return to how these trait bundles interact with climate shocks across regions, because the correlation effects are not symmetrical between rice and wheat systems, and that difference changes the risk profile significantly. But the more immediate question emerging from this structure is simple. If resilience is being encoded into a small number of overlapping genetic pipelines responding to the same climate pressures, then what exactly does food security mean when the system stops behaving like a collection of independent agricultural markets? The easiest mistake at this point is to imagine this as a map problem. Countries holding different pieces of seed genetics, trading them like commodities, competing for share. That model is too clean. What actually exists is closer to a layered engineering stack where biological inputs, legal ownership, and agronomic behavior overlap without ever fully aligning. Let's make that concrete. Take hybrid rice systems used across parts of Southeast Asia and southern China. In simplified terms, a hybrid crop depends on three components: a male sterile line, a maintainer line, and a restorer line. The commercial seed you see in the field is the result of combining those upstream components in controlled ways. The critical point is this: farmers never interact with those upstream layers directly. They only see the output. But control sits upstream. And upstream control is not evenly distributed across institutions or countries. It sits in breeding programs that maintain parent lines, and in IP systems that determine who can reproduce or license them. Now, in the early 2000s, many countries treated this as an open system problem. Improve yield, share germplasm, distribute varieties through international agricultural programs. That logic worked under relatively stable climate conditions. It breaks under volatility, because volatility does something specific to agriculture. It compresses decision-making toward high-performance genetics, even if those genetics come from narrower origins. When a farmer is choosing between a traditional local variety that yields 3 tons per hectare under stress and a hybrid that yields 6 tons but requires annual seed purchase and precise input management, the decision is not ideological. It is arithmetic. Over time, that arithmetic scales into structural dependency. China's role in this system is best understood through institutional layering rather than national framing. On one layer, there are public agricultural research institutes, such as the Chinese Academy of Agricultural Sciences. On another layer, provincial seed companies and joint ventures manage commercialization and field deployment. On a third layer, intellectual property filings secure legal control over specific trait combinations. These layers don't operate as a single coordinated strategy, but they do reinforce each other structurally. That matters because most geopolitical analysis tries to identify intent. In seed systems, intent is less important than throughput. How many viable, licensed, field-tested traits can be moved from lab to farm under real climate conditions? And in that throughput competition, China has built significant capacity in rice and region-specific hybrid systems. But here is where interpretation often goes wrong. This is not a binary dominant structure. It is a network with overlapping zones of influence. The United States, for example, maintains strong control over soybean genetics and large segments of maize germplasm through both corporate and public-private breeding systems. Europe contributes heavily to regulatory frameworks and specialty crop genetics. International research centers act as stabilizers for staple crop improvement in lower-income regions. So the system is not centralized. It is distributed, but unevenly. And uneven distribution becomes important when stress is applied simultaneously across regions. Here is a simple analogy from engineering systems. If you have 5 independent power grids, you assume resilience through redundancy. But if all 5 grids rely on the same transformer design or software protocol, then a specific type of failure can propagate across independent systems. Agricultural genetics behave similarly under climate stress. Different countries may appear diversified in seed sources, but if those seeds share overlapping trait architectures, drought tolerance mechanisms, heat resistance genes, growth cycle optimizations, then their failure modes can correlate under extreme conditions. That correlation is the part that rarely shows up in policy dashboards. Now, introduce climate volatility properly. In the Indo-Gangetic Plain, wheat production cycles are increasingly exposed to short-duration heat spikes during flowering stages. These spikes do not need to last long to affect yield. A few critical days outside optimal range can significantly reduce grain formation. In Southeast Asia, rice systems face different stress: irregular monsoon onset and flood variability during early growth stages. In parts of Africa, the dominant constraint shifts again: rainfall unpredictability combined with soil nutrient depletion. Different geographies, different stress types, but increasingly similar trait responses are being selected: shorter maturation cycles, broader heat tolerance windows, and water efficiency traits. That is convergence under stress pressure. And convergence reduces genetic dispersion in practice, even if variety counts remain high on paper. There is another layer that complicates this further. Modern seed IP is not just about individual traits anymore. It is about stacked trait packages. A single commercial hybrid may include multiple engineered characteristics bundled into one licensed organism. That bundling increases performance, but it also reduces flexibility. You cannot easily replace one trait without restructuring the entire package. This creates what economists would call switching friction, but in biological terms, it is more rigid. It is not just cost, it is yield risk during transition. So even when alternative seeds exist, switching becomes economically irrational unless performance differences are significant. At that point, dependency is not enforced, it is selected. There is a historical reference point here that helps clarify the pattern. During the Green Revolution, high-yield wheat and rice varieties dramatically increased global food production, but they also increased dependence on specific input regimes: fertilizers, irrigation infrastructure, and controlled seed systems. The success was real, so was the structural narrowing that followed. What we are observing now is a second iteration of that logic, but distributed across multiple competing breeding ecosystems rather than a single origin center. And China is one of those ecosystems with strong specialization in certain climate-adaptive crop categories. Not total control, not uniform dominance, but meaningful influence in specific genetic corridors that matter under climate stress. We'll move next into what happens when these corridors overlap across multiple regions simultaneously, because that is where the system stops behaving like agriculture and starts behaving like correlated risk infrastructure. The assumption so far has been that more breeding centers automatically equals more resilience. That assumption starts to fail when you look at what those centers are actually optimizing for. Because modern crop breeding is no longer primarily about expanding diversity. It is about compressing uncertainty. Every major breeding program, whether in China, the United States, or international research consortia, is now under pressure from the same external driver: climate variability that is no longer gradual, but episodic and sharp. That changes the selection logic. Instead of long-term regional optimization, you get repeated convergence toward traits that perform under stress spikes. And stress spikes have a very specific effect on biology. They reduce the usable space of genetic solutions. Let's make that visible in wheat systems first. In northern India and Pakistan, recent growing seasons have included short but intense heat windows during flowering periods. Wheat is especially sensitive at that stage. Even a narrow temperature deviation can disrupt grain formation. What matters is not just yield reduction, but the variance of yield outcomes across similar seed types. Field-level data from agronomic studies in these regions shows something subtle but important. Under stress conditions, performance differences between high-yield varieties narrow. The system becomes less about peak performance and more about failure clustering. That is a statistical shift, not a political one. Now extend that logic to rice systems across Southeast Asia. Rice breeding programs, including those influenced by Chinese research institutions and regional partners, have been increasingly focused on flood resilience, salinity tolerance, and shorter growth cycles. These traits are not unique to any one country. They are shared priorities across multiple climate-exposed regions. But shared priorities produce shared solutions, and shared solutions produce genetic overlap. This is where the system begins to behave differently from what policymakers assume. Because diversity in naming does not equal diversity in function. You can have hundreds of registered rice varieties across multiple countries, but if they rely on a relatively narrow set of underlying trait architectures, drought tolerance genes, heat shock protein expression pathways, water use efficiency modifications, then their response curves under extreme stress begin to correlate. Correlation is the key word, not control, not monopoly, correlation. There is a structural analogy here that is useful, even if imperfect. In financial systems, diversification reduces risk only when assets are truly uncorrelated. If multiple assets respond to the same macroeconomic variable, diversification becomes superficial. Agricultural genetics under climate stress is moving in that direction, not because of coordination, but because of shared environmental constraints. Now bring China back into the frame, but carefully. China's agricultural system is often described in simplified geopolitical terms, but its internal logic is more technical than strategic in the conventional sense. Large portions of its seed development pipeline are designed around domestic environmental constraints. Variable monsoon systems in the south, temperature extremes in northern grain belts, and water management challenges across arid regions. Those constraints produce trait priorities that overlap with other climate-stressed regions globally. That overlap is where influence emerges, not through direct control, but through compatibility. If a breeding system produces traits that perform well under heat and water stress, those traits become attractive in any region experiencing similar stress patterns. This is why certain Chinese-developed or Chinese-linked hybrid rice lines have seen adoption across Southeast Asia and parts of Africa through licensing, joint ventures, and localized breeding partnerships. But again, this is not a linear dependency story. It is a convergence story. And convergence behaves differently under stress than centralized control. Because centralized systems fail in predictable ways, convergent systems fail in correlated ways. That distinction matters more than it appears. Now introduce trait bundling, because this is where the system tightens further. Modern seed IP is increasingly structured around stacked trait packages. Instead of single gene modifications, you get combinations. Drought resistance plus pest resistance plus yield stability enhancements, often integrated into a single licensed hybrid system. This increases performance efficiency, but it also increases structural coupling, because once traits are bundled, they cannot be easily separated without redesigning the entire system. That reduces substitution flexibility across the global seed market. So even when multiple breeding centers exist, they often converge on similar bundled solutions for similar environmental problems. That is how distributed systems begin to behave like synchronized ones under stress. There is a counterpoint that must be acknowledged here. Genetic systems are not rigid machines. They are biological systems with noise, mutation, and adaptation at the local level. Farmers save seeds in many regions. Local breeding still exists. Landrace varieties continue to provide genetic reservoirs that are not fully captured by commercial systems. That is real. But the time scale matters. Local adaptation operates over seasons and decades. Climate stress events are increasingly operating over years and sometimes within single growing cycles. That mismatch creates lag, and lag reduces the protective effect of diversity. There is another layer that rarely enters mainstream discussion: the increasing role of predictive breeding technologies. AI-assisted trait selection, genomic prediction models, and high-throughput phenotyping are compressing breeding cycles dramatically. Traits that once required multi-year field validation can now be screened and iterated in controlled environments before deployment. That accelerates convergence even further, because when optimization cycles speed up, successful trait architectures propagate faster across systems facing similar constraints. So instead of slow divergence between national breeding programs, you get rapid parallel convergence toward high-performance genetic solutions. And that is where the system becomes structurally sensitive. Not because one actor dominates it, but because multiple actors are independently selecting for similar solutions under similar constraints. We'll need to examine what happens when climate shocks hit multiple converged systems at the same time, because that is where correlation turns into geopolitical stress, even without any single point of control. The uncomfortable conclusion from the previous section is not that the system is fragile in a simple sense. It is that it is becoming coherently fragile, meaning different parts fail in ways that start to resemble each other under stress. That is a very different category of risk, because when failures are independent, you can isolate them. When they are correlated, you get cascading pressure even without direct connection. Let's make that visible in agricultural terms. Imagine 3 regions: South Asia wheat belts, Southeast Asian rice systems, and parts of sub-Saharan maize production zones. Each of these regions is technically operating on different seed suppliers, different breeding programs, and different institutional frameworks. On paper, they are independent systems, but under climate stress, they begin selecting for similar traits: heat tolerance, water efficiency, shortened growth cycles, pest resistance under warmer conditions. Now compress time. Not decades, a single season with abnormal heat and rainfall shifts across multiple regions. What matters is not whether crops survive or fail outright, but how much yield variability increases simultaneously across systems that were assumed to be independent. That is where correlation becomes visible, not in normal years, in stress years. China's role in this picture is often misread through a geopolitical lens that focuses on control. That framing misses the more precise mechanism. The more accurate description is this: China is one of several high-capacity breeding ecosystems producing climate-adaptive traits at scale, particularly in rice and certain hybrid systems, shaped by its own internal environmental constraints and agricultural demands. Some of those traits become globally relevant because climate stressors are not unique to one geography anymore. Heat is heat. Water stress is water stress. Flood variability behaves similarly across delta regions regardless of borders. That creates compatibility pathways. And compatibility is more powerful than ownership when systems are distributed. Now here is where the structure tightens further. Modern seed systems are increasingly bundled into trait packages, combinations of genetic characteristics designed to work together: yield stability, drought tolerance, pest resistance, sometimes even nitrogen use efficiency. These bundles are licensed as integrated systems. Once bundled, they are difficult to partially replace without performance loss. That reduces flexibility. And reduced flexibility is the beginning of systemic coupling. Because if multiple regions converge on similar trait bundles, even if sourced from different institutions, then their agricultural responses to extreme climate events begin to synchronize. Not intentionally, structurally. There is a historical echo here worth noting. The Green Revolution dramatically increased global food production by standardizing high-yield crop systems. But it also narrowed dependency pathways on fertilizers, irrigation infrastructure, and controlled seed systems. At the time, this was considered a trade-off worth making, and it was in terms of calories produced. But it introduced a structural feature that is still present today. Agricultural systems optimized for efficiency under expected conditions tend to lose resilience under unexpected ones. What is happening now is not a repetition of that era. It is an evolution of it under climate acceleration and genetic compression technologies. Gene editing tools, CRISPR-based systems, AI-guided trait selection, and high-throughput breeding platforms are reducing the time required to develop and deploy new crop traits. That increases responsiveness, but it also increases synchronization. Because when multiple institutions respond to the same climate signals using similar tools, they often arrive at similar solutions faster. And faster convergence reduces ecological and institutional diversity at the functional level, even if nominal variety increases. Now step back. There is no single actor controlling global seed systems. That is the wrong model. What exists instead is a distributed set of breeding ecosystems: Chinese, American, European, international, all responding to overlapping climate pressures, all optimizing for similar performance constraints, and all increasingly producing compatible genetic solutions. Compatibility is the key word, because compatibility under stress creates correlation. And correlation is what turns local agricultural stress into global systemic sensitivity. This is where policy frameworks lag behind reality. Governments still model food security as a question of supply volume, trade flows, and strategic reserves. Those variables still matter, but they sit downstream of a deeper layer: genetic response architecture. You cannot stockpile adaptation, you can only distribute it, and distribution is now being shaped by a small number of high-capacity breeding systems operating under convergent environmental pressures. So the real question is not whether China controls seed IP for half the world's crops. That framing is too blunt, and it breaks under technical scrutiny. The more precise question is whether global agriculture is moving toward a smaller set of overlapping genetic response systems that behave similarly under extreme climate stress, regardless of who originally developed them. And if that is true, then food security stops being a question of production efficiency. It becomes a question of systemic independence under shared stress conditions. Now, my view, based on the structure of the data, is this. We are not looking at centralized control, but we are looking at emerging correlation risk that most national security frameworks are not designed to measure. My doubt is whether current breeding diversification efforts are actually increasing functional diversity or just increasing the number of names attached to similar trait architectures. My prediction is simple and slightly uncomfortable. The next major global food shock will not be caused by absolute shortages, but by synchronized yield stress across multiple regions that were assumed to be independent. And by the time it is recognized as a structural problem, it will already be expressed as a price and stability crisis, not an agricultural one. And the quiet irony is this: the system will still look diversified on paper, right up until the moment it stops behaving that way in practice. That is where the next real policy debate will start. Not about who owns seeds, but about whether global food systems have unintentionally become synchronized under pressure without ever being centrally designed to be.